Thank you for coming, and thank you to the organizers as well for inviting me over from a fair way away. Since I've actually circulated the paper, I'm not going to talk about the paper at all. You can read it. I'm going to do something slightly different, which is to look at the question of how do we experience the Qur'an, how does the Qur'an inform our lives, and how, in a sense, do we inform our own understandings of what the Qur'an is within the Shi'i context, the Shi'at Nashri context, and that is a context in which I would argue that, of course, the fundamental aspect of Tashayyu is this idea of walaya, of love, devotion, authority of the Imams, of the family of the Prophet, which is essential to one's being, and how that links in with the Qur'an as the two modes in which God reveals herself in the cosmos. So I thought what might be interesting is I just chuck out lots of anecdotal stuff about how these work together in one's life, in the life cycle of an individual. And along the way, I want to also ask some sort of bigger questions, such as, do texts really matter? And if they matter, what do we mean by a text? What is the nature or the normativity of the way in which we behave, in which we read, in which we do things? And I think this is important because sometimes when we teach religion, we tend to focus very much on normative traditions and texts. But of course, as those of us who are brought up in Muslim households know, we didn't read a text to tell us what to do and how to be. As we all know, we learned our faith and how to be from our mothers. We learned from our mothers and from our grandmothers. This might be peculiarly South Asian, but I think it's true. My dad hardly ever told me anything about religion as I was growing up. It was my grandmother in the first instance, and then it was my mother. So in terms of, you go back to the earliest part of your life cycle when an individual is in one's mother's womb, and of course you hear the Qur'an. Your mother reciting Surat Maryam or Surat Yusuf. Surat Yusuf, of course, interestingly, because, of course, the child should be beautiful. Surat Maryam, of course, because the child, the birth should be easy. Surat Yasin, because of its so many merits. You hear this. You heard your mother, when you were in the womb, telling you about the Imams and about the love of the Imams and about how that's so essential. You heard your mother telling you religion is love. What is religion but love, as the famous saying of Imam Sadiq is. And then, of course, a child is born, and part of the naming process then comes back to either the Qur'an or the family of the Prophet. Either taking a name out of the Qur'an, which can unfortunately lead to onion, but it can also lead to Yasin, or taking the name of the Ahlul Bayt, of the family of the Prophet. My own name I'm not named after carpets. I am named after the fourth Imam, Ali Zain al-Abidin, whose title was Sajjad. And then you grow up, you hear it, you are told. I remember this from my grandmother every night going to bed. She said, remember, God is one, the Qur'an is your scripture. These are the Imams, the Prophet, these are the names of the Imams, memorizing the names of the Imams and their titles, memorizing certain short surahs. So even before the formal process of actually learning how to read the Qur'an, we knew what the Qur'an was. We had a familiarity with what it was and what it was supposed to be. It was one way in which it was supposed to give meaning to life. And then one moved on. The interesting thing, of course, about this is how does the textuality work when it does come in? One doesn't have to be, for example, literate to know texts. In many contexts, people know the whole of the Qur'an, in some cases only parts of it, but they don't know how to read. This is something that they've learnt through the orality of a text. One doesn't necessarily need to refer to a theological text which tells us about facilitating grace and why an imam is rationally incumbent upon God to provide, to know that there is an imam and what they are called and the significance of loving them. And then one moves on, you grow up, you start to engage with text perhaps a bit more. You get to the point when you get married. I remember my wedding, sort of the trauma of being hassled by, if you know what a South Asian wedding is, it's not a terribly lacking in traumatic event for the groom and for the bride for that matter. And one of the kind of rituals in a South Asian context is this sort of interesting pretense that the bride and groom have never met. So what happens is you're kind of under this sort of covering, and a mirror is placed before you, and you're supposed to see each other in the mirror for the first time. Of course, it's never really the case. And you are interestingly told to write with your hand, so to speak, a short surah on the forehead of your wife. Again, you can, people tell you, just read what it says in the text and just do it. But I, of course, tried to do it without reading the text, and I made mistakes and had to do it again. These are just very simple, straightforward ways in which we experience things. And then, beyond that, again, when you have your own children, when you go to die, again, it's the Qur'an and the family, the Prophet coming together, the recitation of the Qur'an for the person who's deceased, the way in which the funeral prayer is conducted, the way in which the talqeen is done when you lower someone into the grave, the reminder to the deceased that, when you are questioned in the grave, say these things, which again brings us back to say that when you ask that God is one and my Lord, say that the Qur'an is my scripture, say that Muhammad is my prophet, say that these are my imams, and you list them all. These are, in every single aspect of one's life, there are very formal ways, ritual ways in which the Qur'an and the family, the Prophet impinge, and sometimes less formal. I'll give you one other example for this sort of anecdotal set of introductory remarks. When you travel, again, this might be peculiarly South Asian. I think Iranians do this sometimes, but perhaps others don't. So when you travel, a little band of cloth is tied around your arm, which is called an Imam Zamin. And it's the idea that when you're traveling under the protection of the Imam. And a certain amount of charity is given in the name of the Imam for your protection. And a copy of the Qur'an, the physical artifact, because there are many different ways in which we experience the Qur'an, is placed on your head, and you walk under the shade of the Qur'an to leave the house. So there are all these kind of events in one's life which punctuate the way in which we experience the Qur'an and live what the Qur'an is. And this is far before we even get to questions of exegesis. This is not about, how did exegetical traditions develop. It's in my paper, you can read about that if you want, about how the various phases of how exegetical traditions developed in 12 Shi'i context. But that's, again, not necessarily the way in which most people experience things. Now, I can give you many more anecdotal examples, but I won't. I want to come back to the bigger questions which I raised. To what extent do texts really matter? And then how do we understand what we mean by that text? What sort of signifier is the Qur'an? I have this slightly made-up thing which I do with some of my students, where I say that one of the problems of modern Islam is that people are Qur'anocentric. They think that in any question, the fundamental thing they have to do is say, what does the Qur'an say about X? And what they don't understand is that most Muslim cultural contexts have not been Qur'anocentric, but they have been possessing in what I call Qur'anicity. Qur'anicity is the way in which the Qur'an sort of punctuates one's life, in the way in which it informs things, in the way, as Ingrid mentioned, the interesting hal min mazid, which I think is probably an indication. There's always these jokes about clerics. Clerics eat a lot. Maybe some of us academics do as well. But clerics eat a lot, so there's a sense in which the stomach is like the hellfire. It's a bottomless pit sometimes. So perhaps there was a very deliberate kind of sense of irony there. So there's lots of ways in which our life is imbued by the language and the notions of the Qur'an, even when we don't explicitly know it. So everyone knows the hal min mazid. Not many people could point to where it is in the Qur'an. A lot of people I know Surat Yasin by heart and could just rattle it off. But they might have difficulty finding it in the Mus'haf, in an actual text. So there's lots of examples of this notion of Qur'anicity. The other point I would want to make is about how we experience the Qur'an. There's three potential levels of the experience. One is the actual artifact, and there are certain ways in which we treat the actual book, which is a very important part of it. Again, coming back to marriage, certainly in our family tradition, you cannot have a mahar, or a bride price, I guess the word in English is, without an actual copy of the Qur'an. It would almost be an invalid contract, family tradition. Well, anyway. There's sort of the actual book which is given, the way in which it's dealt, the way in which it is dealt with, the way in which it is venerated, perhaps as well, which is one important part of it. Another part of it is, as I said, the orality of it, the way in which we experience the Qur'an in everyday ways. That's another aspect of the encounter and experience. And the third one, of course, is perhaps the more scholarly one, where you actually are sitting down and reading it to make sense of certain types of things, perhaps to find a reference to something, to look at questions around exegesis and how does a particular Quranic verse speak to some sort of phenomenon that we are engaged with. But I mean, fundamentally, my issue with this question of the text is a very important one, because we were discussing this earlier, but 2 days ago I was teaching a first-year class on Islam in the contemporary world, and as it always is in a study of religion context, the question of Surah An-Nisa verse 34 comes up, and I asked the students, do you think that a man who is prone to beating up his wife does so because the verse says to him that he should do so? Is that how we think it's supposed to work? Or in certain cases, is it the fact that, this is what someone does, and luckily he finds a verse which can justify his action? And we see this happen in court cases. I mean, I was familiar with one fairly recently in Britain, where a chap in East London had been brought up on charges of assault, and said, well, of course the Qur'an gives me the right to do so, and he pointed to this verse. And various experts who were called up to testify, and they said, yes, well, the text may well say that, but is this person doing so because the text says so, or is it a convenient justification for why someone acts? And one wonders, in that sense, what is our relationship with the text? It comes back to this question of exegesis and eisegesis. Do we behave in certain ways because the text directly speaks to us and tells us to do something, or do we just go along with our lives, and then for the convenience of things after the fact, we say, well, actually, I found a really useful verse which justifies this. It reminds me of sometimes the practice. One of my first jobs In fact, my first job was being a postdoc at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, which is an interesting experience in itself. And one of the aspects of the job was quite often you get a call saying, the central office, I'm finishing, the central office would like to talk about X. Can you find a couple of Quranic verses which speak to this? So that's an interesting process of what's going on, which is the tail wagging the dog or the other way around. How do we fundamentally deal with this question of the text? And the final point I will say is that while there is, of course, in the 12 tradition, this complementarity, as you'll read in the paper, fundamentally it's the person of the Imam who actually defines what the Qur'an is anyway, or who reveals God in the primary sense. So much so that there's a whole tradition of exegesis which argues that the only way in which you can make sense of the Qur'an is through the sayings of the Imams, and there is no other way of glossing the text. But as I said, you can read about that in the paper. Thank you.
I had a question about Quranocentric versus Quranicity.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about Quranicity?
Yeah.
Like how that's different?
I think it's a question of, fundamentally, is the Qur'an the primary or even the sole signifier, or is it part of this higher sort of more developed melange of different sources and influences which are weaved into our language and to our lives? So my argument is that the language and the reality of the Qur'an is something which is weaved into human life, or into Muslim life in particular. But Qur'anocentrism is a particular kind of privileging of a singular text as the only way in which one identifies what it means to be Islamic, which I think is a peculiarly modern phenomenon. I know a lot of people disagree with me on that, but I think there is something about that. When you look at very simple things like read a pre-modern theological text, just read a pre-modern exegesis or a work of fiqh, of Islamic law, and you find that references to Quranic verses are often very sparse indeed. It's not even structured in that way. So I think there is, and this is where I would argue that everything from sort of some classic Orientalists all the way through to Salafis in the modern period and modernists, they all agree on this. I mean, this is the deepest problem and malaise in the contemporary world, is this notion that Islam is somehow very simple. It speaks primarily through the Qur'an. You can just you can just mine it for basic information which tells you what is normative in Muslim life. And my argument is this just doesn't work at all. Yeah.
Just picking up on that, because I think it's so important, and I love the stories that you told. Modernists, Salafis, or the Salafi modernists and Salafi textualists, and Orientalists, I think, all also agreed that the problem with Islam is Muslims are superstitious. They care too much about ritual. They don't really understand the Qur'an. They use it in this ritual cultural way. So all the beautiful things that you spoke about, they said, well, that's just superstition. That's just the ignorant people who don't read the Qur'an, but they just use it. And I think this is a huge problem, because it's a denial of the Qur'an as the sacred word of God, of creating sacred time and space. And could you want to say something a little bit more about that? Because you described, the Qur'an, weaving the Qur'an into these ceremonies for travel and for marriage. So can you just speak a little bit more about that?
I think it comes back to what we understand to be normative, or what we understand to be human. I think it is precisely those sorts of ritual and everyday encounters, which are normal. A sort of a textual turn is not necessarily a normal one. There is a sense in which, again, it goes back to what I would describe as a distinction between a modern and a pre-modern context. In a pre-modern context, you could say maybe it's just because there aren't as many people who are literate, but the recourse to text is in a very different way. The way we grow up, the way we learn about what it means to be a believer is through very simple things that you learn from people around you. You know, no one learns how to pray from a book. It just isn't the case. You learn because you see people pray. You know, you see this when you're, well, I mean, I don't remember when I was like 1 or 2, but I see this like with my kids, you know, you're praying and your son or daughter comes and does like a sajjad in front of you, and, you know, they don't know what they're doing.
Backwards, but
yeah, or in any direction, right? But you see things, and so you imitate. It's kind of a lived acculturation. And actually, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. Perhaps Nat has something to say on this. Yeah, please.
Well, I think that is true. If you're inside of a particular community, many people in other communities did actually learn how to pray from a book. So I think that there needs to be some extension of the experience. You know, I don't know necessarily that they're experiencing the text, but that the text becomes a kind of vicarious way for having learned from older folk, you know, parents or grandparents, pray. So maybe you, in some iteration, because I'm loving it, would want to think about how to expand that, just to be a little broader.
I think that. See, I suspect that's true in an initial stage, but then beyond that, you know, there's all sorts of ways in which, for example, something like prayer is embellished. And I think a lot of those embellishments are not necessarily things we pick up in a book, but they could be something we heard. You know, so you see someone do something which is a bit different, which is a bit extra, for example, in Sajjad, say, or a particular type of recitation. You think, oh, okay, that sounds really good. I think I'll try that. You hear something in terms of the initial act of making an intention. That, you know, there's lots of sort of separate prayers that you can do, and you hear it and you think, okay, that's quite interesting. Maybe I'll try that. So I think, you know, it works in both ways, but I suspect in some cases, I mean, I'm just thinking of a friend of mine who did not grow up as Muslim, did indeed originally learn how to pray through a book, but then everything else that he says he does now is a result of those sorts of interactions beyond that. So I don't think it's necessarily an either-or situation.
No, I'm not saying it's like that.
No.
I'm just talking about broadening.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I agree. I mean,
I
yeah.
like the experiential
Yeah.
portion of it. And I'm thinking about a folk here in the States, perhaps in Canada, who come and they, you know, I remember one student of mine who kind of shimmied up, not Muslim, trying to figure out what namaz was.
Yeah.
It was really worrying him.
Right.
Because he was saying, well, they're going to make namaz. When is somebody going to make salat? Which, you know, are they, you know, is this a different tradition? And should I follow them in this? Or should I, you know, stay over here with the salat people?
But you see, that's one thing which I find quite interesting. As someone who is certainly not an Arab, although I am a descendant of the Prophet, which is a card to play, which is really useful in many contexts, especially with Arabs. I think the non-Arab contexts are really important. You know, I find the normativity of a particular Arab experience really problematic in the modern period. And this works in lots of ways. It doesn't even have to necessarily be Salafi. which is sort of from the Arab Peninsula. But like, for example, in the Shia context, sometimes Iraqi practices are seen as normative because they're Arabs. And I find that very problematic because that's not what I grew up with. And as far as I'm concerned, Shiism or Tashayyu is what my grandmother taught me. So, and she was not an Arab. Well, actually, she was half Arab, but that's a different matter. So, and that's what counts. So I think we need to be a bit careful. Also, the issues around dress and so forth. This is how someone dresses. This is how they don't dress. I mean, things are so much more fluid than that. You don't have to dress in a particular way to be. It's really what fundamentally is within you, which expresses that. And I come back to this, this thing, this famous saying of Imam Sadiq, "What is religion but love?" This is something I remember hearing as a kid, and sort of seeing it. So that's, we say that that's the strongest argument against something like ISIS is precisely that. But this is an experience we've always had. Why have we forgotten things like this? It's a powerful argument. It sometimes comes across as being soft, but it doesn't have to be soft. It's actually an extremely strong argument against sort of willful forms of violence which are unjustified.
Just very quickly, so
Yeah.
Sajjad, so how to take what you just said to actually implement that in a classroom setting?
Yeah.
Because all the classes about the Qur'an is highly intellectualized,
Yeah.
and it's based specifically about esoteric writings or exegesis. So in the studies of the Qur'an in Muslim Academy, we never do what you just said. We've actually looked into this in the first place. As some sort of represented how the Qur'an really touches the punctual design, basically.
I think this is the problem, and I mean, Todd and I were talking about this yesterday. There's so little written about this. There's the odd article which might be sort of anthropological in nature, which talks about experiences. There's the art of reciting the Qur'an book, but there's not much which you would give to a student, and this is a bit of a problem unless you start being quite creative. And one of the things I used to do, I hardly do any teaching nowadays, but I did before is I'd play them qawwalis by someone like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And in the qawwali you have material which is in Urdu, you have material which is in Arabic, which is quite often Quranic, you have material which is Persian, in many cases very famous Persian poetry. And you see how this whole thing is weaved together. And then you actually realize that singing of the qawwali is an act of worship. It's a way of connecting to God. It's not for your entertainment. I think that's what people need to understand. Sometimes there are concert settings in which you experience these things, but they are, it is worship. And I remember speaking a long time ago when Nusrat Ali Khan was still alive. I invited him to Oxford, and he gave a performance. And before that, I said, "So what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I will do what comes to me, in my conversation with God. But it will have a certain order because there is an adab to how you do these things." And I said, "Well, there are requests for this, that, and the other." He said, "Yes, but that doesn't matter. That's all well and good, but I'll do it in the way that I do it."
Thank you so much.
Thank you.